Is there really a taste difference between farm raised and wild caught salmon? And what are the environmental impacts of each? That's what I'm gonna try to explain in today's video. This piece of fish right here is an Ora King salmon, which is a farm raised salmon from New Zealand. And in this video today, I'm gonna make 3 different recipes with this Ora King salmon and some wild King salmon from Alaska as well. And I'll tell you which one I think tastes better. For the taste test, I'm gonna prepare the salmon 3 different ways. I'm gonna do, of course, some air fried salmon and then some sashimi and also some salmon candy. Now, like I said, this is the farm raised salmon, and looking at it, the one thing I really noticed is it's super, super fatty. As I'm cutting it, my hands are actually getting oily from all the fat in the flesh, and I was really surprised because I've never experienced that before with any other salmon. Now, I got these pieces of salmon all prepared and cut out that little spot right there, which is probably like a ruptured blood vessel or something like that, and the farm raised salmon was ready for the taste test. Next up is the wild caught salmon, and this is wild Alaskan king salmon. This was actually a whole fillet, and the other one was actually a part of a fillet, so I cut off the tail and then went right down the middle of the fish to remove the top loin and the belly. At this point, I could tell that there wasn't as much fat on this wild salmon, but there was still a ton of good marbling within the fillet itself. The meat also felt firmer to the touch than the Ora King salmon, which isn't surprising since there is less fat. And if you take a look at this cut right here, while there is some marbling in the wild caught fillet, it's not nearly as much as you saw in the farm raised Ora salmon. Now, the first preparation I'm going to do is actually getting some salmon ready to become a saku block for sashimi. Now, you want to make sure you remove the pin bones from the salmon, and both the wild caught and the farm raised salmon had these pin bones in them, but if you get them from a fishmonger, they might have actually already removed them for you. Now, to get them ready for sashimi, what you're going to do is you're going to brine them. Now, I like using salt for my brine instead of sugar, so put down some kosher salt on a plate and lay the piece of fish on that salt. Now, make sure you get all sides covered by the salt and let it sit in the refrigerator for about 30 minutes. Now, while that was sitting, I got the air fryer salmon ready, and I just spritzed some avocado oil on each side of the fillets and then sprinkled with some salmon rub. I try to keep it simple just so the fish itself really stood out, and I put it in the air fryer at 400 degrees for about 12 minutes or so. The last thing I'm making is actually salmon candy, and you're going to take the belly of the fish. I like removing the skin, I just find it tastes better to me, and then you're going to slice it into about 1-inch thick pieces and add it to a plastic bag to marinate. The marinade is simple. I use about a half a cup of maple syrup, a half a cup of brown sugar, and about 3 tablespoons or so of kosher salt. You're going to let it sit in the marinade, I like overnight, and then let it smoke on the lowest possible setting on your smoker. While this cooks, here are my thoughts on the wild caught versus farm raised salmon debate.
So when I started looking into the farm raised versus wild caught debate, I really came up with like a few categories that I looked at each one of the fish with. And the first one, of course, is the environmental impact. And wild caught salmon and farm raised salmon actually both have a pretty big impact on the environment. And not just wild caught salmon, as in the salmon themselves, but the fisheries that target those wild salmon. Now, as far as farm raised, it's pretty well known. One of the biggest things is that a lot of them are located in open net or open pen ones, which means they're out in the same water as some of these salmon or even just as other marine life. And with that many salmon packed into a small area, you can get tons of waste. And that waste drops down to the bottom and creates a toxic sludge. And it also creates dead zones or areas where no life can live because the organic matter is actually breaking down, decaying, and consuming all the oxygen in the water, creating those dead zones. So obviously, that's a really, really troubling thing for those farms. And there have been attempts to make it less impactful on the environment in those areas, but from what I understand, it still is a huge issue, even in the best farms in like Norway or the one in New Zealand too, where we got the Ora salmon from. It just is something that can't be avoided. Not only do farm raised salmon affect kind of the waters around them, they can escape and breed with other salmon as well, which makes it so you might not have that, true native salmon anymore in those waters. And that's a really troubling thing, especially when a whole ecosystem can balance around that one apex predator. And last but not least, one that is commonly talked about is a lot of salmon that are farm raised are fed antibiotics, and those antibiotics can get out in the water, or even worse, if they're not fed an antibiotic, then those farm raised salmon can get parasites and sea lice that is spread to the wild population and can make it so that wild population of salmon can get sick. Now, wild salmon fisheries have an impact on the environment as well. With the huge demand for salmon, in the United States and worldwide, let's just face it, there's not enough wild population to do that. And it's been something that we've seen a lot of overfishing because of all that demand. So just to say that because farm raised does those things to the environment it should be gone, it's probably not the best argument, because if we rely solely on the wild population, the fact of the matter is, we're going to decimate the wild population as well. And if we decide to pull back a little bit and only have the wild population, um, then the prices are going to be so high, you're not going to be able to afford even just one piece of salmon. Now to the community impact, look, wild caught salmon, communities have been built around it, whether it's the fishery, the canning, or just like the processing of it. A lot of communities in the Pacific Northwest and other places are built around the fact that there's a salmon fishery there, and they're being undercut by farm raised salmon. And I 100% understand that. But the problem is, there's just not enough product to go around for all the demand. And so then these farm raised salmon have come in. Now, at the same time, I get that those bigger companies are killing some of those smaller businesses, but around those bigger companies in Chile and Norway and places like that, other communities are starting to form. And if those were to be shut down, that could be problematic too for those communities as well. So I guess my answer to you is, it's really not as easy as you think. I do agree that farm raised salmon probably is a bigger negative impact, not just on the culturals or the societies that are around the salmon fishery, but also environmentally, it's got a huge impact. But fishing the wild caught salmon population to a point that it's not sustainable is also a huge issue as well. And you're not just going to see ecological disaster when that happens, you're also going to see communities collapse the same way that it would if, farming widespread took over. So in my head, before I do the taste test, what I would say some of the most important things to take away from this is, one, reduce your consumption of salmon. I think that's the biggest thing that we can all do, is just not eat as much as a nation, because the only reason why this huge market for salmon exists, because people think it's the best fish to eat when it comes to health benefits. Look for other fish like mackerel, and I'll try to highlight some here too, just so you have a good idea of other foods you can eat that are just as heart healthy as salmon. And maybe that will reduce some of the pressure on the salmon fishery and other fisheries as well. Number two, if you are going to buy farm raised salmon, and this is something I'm going to be trying to do from now on, buy land based farm raised salmon, because it just means it's going to be a cleaner product that has less impact on the natural waters that you're going to see other fish and salmon swim around in. I think that's a good compromise between, getting enough product out there for everybody and not really affecting the natural environment that the salmon might be in, and hopefully making it so, you know, a wild caught salmon fishery and a farm raised salmon fishery can kind of coexist and meet the demand that is needed out there.
Now it's time for the taste test, and first up is going to be the cooked salmon, and I'm trying the wild caught salmon first. Looking at the fillet, it doesn't look dry at all. It looks nice and moist, and giving this a taste, I was surprised. This right here, this bite was the best salmon that I've ever tasted in my life. This wild caught salmon was absolutely delicious. There was a good amount of fat in there. There was like a nice buttery taste to it, but it still had a good texture as well. Next up was the farm raised salmon, and putting my fork into it, I realized that this had even more fat dripping out of it, but the mouthfeel of it to me was like just too soft. It wasn't firm like normal salmon, and it just kind of like fell apart or disintegrated in your mouth as you ate it. Next up was the salmon sashimi, and after rinsing the saku blocks of that salt, they were ready to use. Now I wanted to make pretty thin slices on here, and the first one again is the ora salmon, and you can just see how much marbling is in that little piece of salmon. And now onto the wild caught, and there was still some marbling in there. There's still a ton of fat actually in the wild caught, but it's not as much. And when I felt the fish, again, it felt firmer. And based on just touching these two pieces of fish, I'm thinking I'm gonna like the wild caught better, because I like a firmer fish when I'm having sashimi. Now I just kept it traditional, no wasabi, just a little bit of soy sauce. I first dipped the farm raised salmon into the soy sauce, gave it a taste, and just like the cooked salmon, it just melts in your mouth. It's what I imagine wagyu tastes like. I've never had wagyu before, but everything I've heard, it just kind of melts in your mouth, and that's what that was like. Now it's time for the wild caught salmon, and there was still a good amount of that like fattiness to it, but it was still firm and it held together really well. I really think for this one too, the wild caught is going to win out for the sashimi taste test. And last but not least is the salmon candy, and the first one I'm gonna try again is the wild caught. It had a good smoky flavor, but it was a little bit dry, and maybe it's because I cooked it too long, but after tasting the farm raised salmon, I feel a higher fat content fish like this farm raised salmon did a lot better in this recipe. So for salmon candy, I probably would give farm raised salmon the edge.
Honestly, the last thing that I'll say is, if all this makes you feel overwhelmed, that's okay. What I would say right now is just at the very least, reduce the amount of salmon you eat just because it will put a little less pressure on both the desire to have more farms and the wild caught salmon population. And if I'm giving any one of them a slighter edge, right now, I'd say I would choose wild caught salmon first, and then probably look for a land based farm raised salmon, and then look for those open pound or open net salmon farms that are out there. So